Art History 114, History of Brazilian Art and Architecture, Petacucha Final, voiced by me, Karen Huynh. Since the start of the nation, Brazilian art has been largely concerned with representing the Brazilian body. This first section of the presentation will go over the evolution of how the Brazilian body has been depicted and objectified throughout Brazilian art history. This will be done by chronologically going through the different Brazilian art movements. Albert Eckhout's series of 8 figures represents the male and female bodies of 4 different social groups in Brazil. The figures get progressively more dignified the higher up they are on the social rankings and the whiter they get. This is evidenced by the mixed-race Mameluca woman and mulatto man being more covered up and assuming classical Greco-Roman poses. The top 4 figures represent the Tapuia and the Tupi. Though both indigenous, the Tapuia body is left bare and is represented as primitive, while the Tupi body is somewhat covered up. This is because the Tupi are indigenous Brazilians that have been Christianized. Through his depictions, Eckhout asserts that the Brazilian bodies deserve more dignity and respect when they are more aligned with Western ideals. Speaking of Western ideals, Maraba and Moama both depict quote-unquote Brazilian women with very European aesthetics. From their names and literary context, we know that these women are indeed Brazilian. But despite this, their Brazilian bodies are represented in an idealized Italian Renaissance fashion, perhaps to be more digestible to the European eye. Modernismo is all about digestion, but this time in relation to anthropophagy. Stephanie D'Alessandro details the extensive process of consumption and digestion of ideas and influences that went into making a negra. This cannibalism led to a new vigoration of the Afro-Brazilian body that is abstracted, weird, and stereotypical in the strange and grotesque ways. Portinari's representation of the Afro-Brazilian body was a step in a new direction as it aimed to dispel any negative conceptions of the Afro-Brazilian body. He literally and metaphorically elevates the Afro-Brazilian man and dignifies him. The man's sheer size speaks to both his importance and physical power, and the idyllic coffee farm behind him is a testament to both. A discussion of the representation of the Brazilian bodies would be incomplete without any mention of the concrete art movement. The Ruptura Manifesto explains that though it was genius for a time, art had progressed past the need for figuration. Geometric abstraction was the new wave. So art at this time was rational, lacked human qualities, and was overall devoid of the human form. In 1964, Helio Oiticica brought back the human form in full effect with Parangole. Parangole is an experiential piece that heavily depends on the human body to be fully effective. Without the integration of the human body, the work is just pieces of painted fabric. This was a great reintroduction of the Brazilian body in Brazilian art. The 60s were a tough time in Brazil as it was under a military dictatorship. Censorship was suffocating, and many artists tried their best to live in subtlety. Antonio Henrique Amaral depicted bruised, bounded, and rotting bananas in his work. This is semiotic genius because it's an adaptive shift to represent the Brazilian body and everything it endures in a subtle way. I wanted to include Ligia Papi's Caixa Brazil because it's such an interesting way to represent the female Brazilian body. Inside a luxurious box are pieces of indigenous European and African hair. The Brazilian body is both hyper-feminized and exoticized here because hair has the ability to be both. It's such an out-of-the-box piece that uses parts to represent the whole. Brazil maintains the mindset that it's a nation that's perpetually on the cusp of greatness, of international authority, of modernity. The second section will go over the efforts of many different Brazilian artists to prove to both the world and themselves that Brazil can be a modern powerhouse. This was done through experimental art forms and risky architectural endeavors. The Modern Art Week in Sao Paulo, a manifestation of Modernismo in Brazil, was one of the first instances in which Brazilian art was attempting to establish a modernized identity. This movement was all about rejecting Western academic traditions of art in favor of a new Brazilian tradition, one that was keenly focused on dealing with Brazil's colonial past and present in a productive way. Anthropophagy, one of the key concepts of Modernismo, can be simply explained as a reappropriation of Brazil's cannibalist stereotype. In Oswald de Andrade's eyes, anthropophagy is about cannibalizing external influences to create new, authentic Brazilian art form. This art form was to mark Brazil's break from tradition and entrance into modernity. Nowhere is this concept clearer than in Tarsila do Amaral work. In her work, Amaral canalizes her classical training, which manifests in a conventional style, the influences of artists that both came before her and were around her, and her experiences living in Europe and Brazil. Amaral takes in all of this to create a new aesthetic that would be uniquely Brazilian. Brazil's efforts to make work at the vanguard largely includes its built forms. Brasilidade was a nebulous concept that had twin goals of asserting Brazilianness and Brazilian modernity. It aimed to do this by way of Brazilian architecture, which was contradictorily heavily influenced by European architects like Le Corbusier. Brazilian architects like Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer were heavily influenced by Le Corbusier when designing the Ministry of Health and Education. They even flew in the European architect himself to participate in the planning. This building adopts the 5 elements of modern architecture to be compatible with Brazil. It was Brazil's way of participating in this new era of architecture. However, there was a growing conflict. The relationship between Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer was a tense one. In his autobiography, Oscar Niemeyer recounts how Pampulha was a landmark project that was pivotal to his break from Le Corbusier. In it, he writes, "Pampulha was the beginning of my life as an architect." And it was. Niemeyer described Pampulha as the opportunity to evolve beyond expected conventions of modern (European) architecture. He did so with curves, which became part of his signature Brazilian style. It's interesting to note how even though Le Corbusier disapproved of Niemeyer's break from conventions, he eventually began to be influenced by it, as told by Niemeyer. It's important to highlight that although Brazil was trying to achieve modernity via their built forms, these urban improvements were indivorceable from Brazil's past. Camilla Curin and Simon Romero write about the Valongo Wharf, which was revealed to be an archaeological site for Brazil's history of slavery. This wharf was continually covered over in attempts of modernization. Finally, the concrete art movement was another opportunity for Brazil to be at the vanguard and prove its modernity. Brazil's take on concrete art was authentic, in that it made use of materials that were already available. Villamengue brought in bulk wood to make his art. It was also a response to the industrialization happening in Brazil.